Hello and welcome to week one of our Lent course, Faith and the Pandemic, when we're going to be exploring some of the resources that our faith can offer us as we move through this time. I've used a couple of books in particular in my preparation. The first is this book by Walter Brueggemann, Virus as a Summons to Faith. Now, Brueggemann is an American Old Testament scholar. He's one of the most celebrated scholars at the moment on the Old Testament, and I loved this book, I must admit. I hope that you will find some of the things it draws our attention to really useful as we go through the course. And I've also drawn on this book by Tom Wright, God and the Pandemic. Tom Wright is a New Testament scholar. I like the way that his name seems to chime with that. He's also an Anglican bishop. He's written considerably on the life of Jesus and a number of very readable concordances. Very good, and some of his reflections on the early church and the way in which they dealt with situations is quite helpful, and I'll be feeding in some of that as we go through. I did say in the flyer that I'd also be looking at Julian of Norwich and trying to bring some of her reflections to the current situation. I did have a book in mind, but actually I wasn't so keen on the author when I began to read it. So I'm going back to her original set of reflections, but I hope I won't use her quite so much, but I will put a little bit of her experience and her teaching in there as well. So I don't know about you, but I had very few reference points for this pandemic. The Spanish flu would have been in the memory just about of my grandparents, but I think that perhaps the horrors of World War I and of World War II for the generation before them and after them had a way of taking over public memory. The closest outbreak to me probably was the AIDS epidemic, all the horrors of that as that was coming on stream. But that happened to other people, and even the recent Ebola outbreak and mad cow disease, various other things seem very far away. I know movies about outbreaks and pandemics I would just dismiss as a little fantastical. Little did I know, as it turns out. In short, I think as a society we've come to this pandemic a little naked, without preparation or previous learned experience from the community to guide us. But curiously enough, pandemics have affected our Christian communities right from the beginning. You can see here the two early plagues which affected the early Christian community. And Rodney Stark, in his book, The Rise of Christianity, has argued that the way Christians behaved in the great plagues of early centuries was a significant factor contributing to the spread of the faith. Certainly Emperor Julian, who was trying after Constantine's time to deconvert the Roman Empire, complained that Christians were much better at looking after the sick and the poor, and this was impeding his efforts to de-Christianize. And in our scriptures, plagues occur time and again, if you look for them, most often in this triad of war, pestilence and famine. It's a kind of vicious circle where the presence of one makes the other more likely. It's naturally so. We can see it in the world around us today. If you look at Yemen and the famine there that's been so greatly made and exacerbated by the war. Or this picture is from 1812. It's depicting the 1812 French army as it marches on Moscow, but of course it was defeated by typhus long before it reached Moscow, and the conditions of the army made the spread of the louse that's transmitted the disease that much more possible. So a natural kind of circle, these three, and it appears time and again in the scriptures. We're going to look at some of those. So the first set of verses are from the book of Leviticus, the book of the law, to do with the Mosaic covenant. And there you can see Moses with the 10 Commandments. And you see there how the three are together. In Leviticus, this is seen as a punishment for not keeping the law, and the punishment is in three forms. The sword, so that's the war, the pestilence or plague, and the staff of bread being broken. So later in King David's time, we have these verses in 2 Samuel. We have David being asked which of these three punishments he would prefer: 3 years of famine, or 3 months of war, or 3 days of the plague. A little bit later on at what he chose and why. Here we have in 2 Chronicles the antidote which is given to the Israelites for disasters which fall upon them. And how are the disasters depicted? In that same group, the sword, here with judgment added, or pestilence, or famine. And then skipping to the end of the Bible, as you can, here we have the book of Revelation and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And how are they symbolised? What are their names? Well, the first 2 are to do with war, the second one is to do with famine, and the third one, death, combines all 3, sword, famine, and pestilence. So we can see how the triad is there throughout the scriptures, but what explanation is given for them? How is the presence of plague dealt with? There are several different ways, and before we go into them, we're only going to cover really one main option today, and then we'll look through and come to a bit more of a conclusion as the weeks go on. But a word of caution before we begin. I remember my biblical studies tutor saying that in the Old Testament there isn't one single moral stream. There are different themes and voices. As we might see today as we look at the Christian church throughout the world, there are different perspectives, the same faith, but different perspectives. We're familiar with this in the scriptures, particularly with the New Testament, the 4 Gospels giving their own perspectives on the life of Jesus, things they include, things they don't, and so on. Or in the with the early church, with the differences between the apostles. The way that each of them writes shows their different priorities and emphases. Absolutely the same case with the Old Testament. Now, if I ask you about plagues in the Bible, I would expect you would think most immediately of the 10 plagues of Egypt. So not all of them strictly plagues in the way that we are experiencing this pandemic, but some consisting of illnesses, mysterious, that struck down cattle and struck down children. So what was the purpose of those plagues? We know the story well. We know they were the means of persuading the Egyptians to let the Israelites go free. And certainly that was the outcome. But if you look at these verses that I've put at the side there, the explicit purpose was that so that Israel would know that God was God. And then a little bit later, so that the Egyptians would know that I am God. God here is able to mobilize the forces of creation for God's own ends. God can act through creation. In these plagues of the Exodus, they are purposeful and controlled, not random. They attack Egypt only, and not the Israelites. So we have a God controlling forces of nature for a specific purpose. And we see that in many other places. Here is a little quote from the beginning of Isaiah, where the prophet is telling of the day of the Lord, where unnamed forces will be mobilized so that God will be exalted. Towards the end of the book of Job, we have the whirlwind speeches, the conversation between Job and God. Begins, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? We see this awesome creator God challenging Job, who, faced with God's utter awesomeness, feels his own smallness and insignificance. He comes up against the mystery of God and God acting in freedom in ways beyond our either understanding or right to challenge. We see this in other places too. In Isaiah, we hear this, for the Lord of hosts has planned, and who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? Later in Isaiah, woe to you who strive with your maker, earthen vessels with the potter. Does the clay say to the one who fashions it, what are you making? Or your work has no handles? Other examples of our inability to question God, our lack of a warrant to question God, and the ability of God to act freely. Now, of course, the disasters that befall Job are not the result of his sin. As you know, I'm sure the book of Job as a whole looks at this problem of suffering, particularly when bad things happen to good people. And it looks at that in a very complex way. Elsewhere in the scriptures, we don't see always that same complexity. Indeed, there seems to be a simple quid pro quo at work in places. In some places, but most notably within the Mosaic covenant, so after the people of Israel have escaped from Egypt and are entering the promised land, calamities and disasters that befall them are clearly seen as punishment for sin, for not keeping the covenant. So the book of Deuteronomy is written as if it was at that moment of crossing over into the promised land. And the writers are saying here is the blessing and the curse. And the blessing if you obey the commandments of God, and the curse if you do not obey. Actually, it's thought that the book was actually written later than that, but looking back to the words of Moses and the Mosaic covenant and urging people to turn back to that original vision and that relationship with God. So here we have again that passage from Leviticus that I cited a bit earlier on about the triads of war, pestilence and famine. And you see how that is all set up as a punishment. There are symmetrical phrases there. If you continue your hostility, then I will be hostile to you. And the hostility comes in those three forms: sword, pestilence and famine. Many times also in the prophets we have disasters as seen as punishment for sin. Ultimately, of course, the loss of the land because the house of Israel hasn't followed the covenant of Moses. And here you see in Ezekiel the punishment again with that triad of sword, famine and pestilence. There are, however, many scriptures which have a different approach than this blessing and curse transaction. If you look back to the Israelites, for example, they are in slavery in Egypt, but there's no suggestion in those scriptures that they're there because of their own sin. They were just there because of the famine. And again, the famine at that point isn't because of sin. It was just it there, and God warned people about it and helped them deal with it. I'm sure you can think of many scriptures as well, especially from the life of Jesus, which also have a different view to this. However, then, we mustn't be too hasty, I suggest, to dismiss this either. Can our treatment of the environment, for example, be seen as influential in the pandemic? And on a basic level, do we not teach our children some basic moral code? Do good to others and they will do good to you. Is this not part of our teaching at some level? So that brings us to the end of today's presentation. They are but broad brushstrokes today, really. We've seen the triad of war, plague and famine in history and across the scriptures. We've seen two strands in the Old Testament, God using the forces of creation as God wills, and creation being affected by our sin, those direct choices of the Israelites resulting in blessing or curse. I wonder which of those two you are more comfortable, or maybe you're not comfortable with either. So these are the questions that link with the material that we've been talking about. I'd suggest you just start though by saying what stood out for you, what struck you, whether it's something you liked or disliked, agreed with, disagreed with, or if you have questions about particular things, just go with that initially. And then the three questions I have are these. Do you think God is at work in nature today? If so, how? Do you think this pandemic is linked with our behaviour? If so, in what way? And finally, we've looked at some of the scriptures that link our circumstances with sin. What scriptures can you think of that suggest